My research area is labor market dynamics, but also economic measurement. I came up as a young researcher coming out of the federal statistical system, in large part because that's where all the data was, and I wanted to work with it. But also because, relevant to this audience here, I actually started in economic development before I went to grad school. And so when I encountered this group at Census that was working to produce like more improved state and local data, I was like, oh, I know exactly what the data gap you were trying to fill. Like, this frustrated me constantly when I worked in economic development. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed throughout my career is getting data in the hands of people who want to use it to understand their local economies, to attract businesses to their local economies, to better plan things. So this is all to say, I've been working with data a very long time, but I cannot think of a single period like the last 6 years in terms of emphasizing the importance of data for understanding the path of the US economy. There's been just an enormously turbulent time between COVID and now. As Mike mentioned, I worked in the Biden Council of Economic Advisors. I got there in the fall of 22. That was the peak of inflation. The labor market was still struggling to recover from the pandemic. This was the era of why does nobody want to work anymore articles in the New York Times every day. You recall that. And the Fed began hiking rates, and every newspaper in the country was predicting that we were about to enter a recession. And every month we would parse through all of the data, in particular BLS data, looking for signs that the recession was upon us. And month after month after month, I kept reporting to the White House. I'm like, I don't see it yet. I just don't see it. I know the New York Times says it's coming, but I don't see it in the data. And as you all know now, it didn't come. We actually had a pretty smooth transition from 9% inflation to 3% inflation without a lot of labor market pain, which was pretty remarkable. The US economy doesn't announce its turning points in advance. It communicates through data, and that data is essential for understanding both the path of the economy and where we are on that path. So that's what I want to talk about today. So this white print that you can't see very well says, why is trust vital? So good, high quality, trustworthy economic data is vital because it has real economic implications. In countries like the US, where we have a tremendous amount of high quality, very timely data, there are real economic dividends. So what data does fundamentally is it lowers uncertainty. And that lowering of uncertainty has real economic dividends. It results in lower inflation because there is an actual price level to look at, which means people aren't arguing over the price level. Before we had price data in the US, we had a lot of price volatility. In part because people couldn't agree on how much the price level was changing. Economic uncertainty, narrowing that, also incentivizes business investment, both domestic and foreign. If you're trying to attract foreign investment in your community, it really helps if the companies can look at all of this economic data and feel like they have a good understanding of what the economic conditions are. And less economic volatility. So we have fewer business cycles, not recently, but historically, since we have all of this data. In part because modern monetary policy, which uses an enormous amount of data, helps us get ahead of business cycles. So does fiscal policy. It helps us react to business cycles. So there's just less economic volatility when you have better data. You can also look at cases where the data has been manipulated or is untrustworthy to see some of the consequences in real time. So some of the most catastrophic cases were the Soviet Union and Mao's Great Leap Forward. Both themes in both cases were regional Producers and managers had incentives to inflate data. It led to enormous mismanagement, famines in many cases. The downhill of the Soviet Union is widely attributed to be in part because of mismanagement. What happens when you start manipulating data is the government itself loses sight of what's happening and starts mismanaging things and making mistakes. So more modern examples, Greece in the Eurozone crisis, so Greece suppressed their true deficits, and this actually led to much worsening of the Eurozone crisis in Greece and throughout the EU because of this manipulation of the data. Argentina famously started manipulating their inflation data. This also led to worsening economic crises in Argentina. So how do you build this trust? What does it consist of? So there are a few fundamentals. One, and this is probably obvious from the examples I just gave, independence from political interference. Both manipulation of data, but also incentivizing the manipulation of data. And very related to that is the professionalization of the statistical services. You really want your statistics coming from pointy-headed nerds who will lecture you endlessly about different approaches to seasonal adjustment and their pros and cons. That is the people you want running your statistical service, not the political appointees who have different incentives. Transparency and open communication. This was something that was a big theme while I was at BLS, in part because, and I'll bring this up later, we're just in a much more difficult information environment than we've been historically. There's much more fragmentation. There's a lot more people choosing their own facts. And openness and transparency really help sort of clear the air. And accuracy. So I'm going to mention, so I'll get more into this in a couple of slides, but obviously the statistical agencies are more trustworthy if their data is known to be of high quality. The place where this has eroded recently is the Office of National Statistics in the UK, which used to have an outstanding reputation and has recently come upon troubled times. The white text here is global headwinds to trust in official statistics. So when I was running BLS, I got asked all the time, what can the statistical agencies do more to improve trust in data? I mean, like, you go on social media and it's like, of course all the data is fake, like, you can't believe anything, like, these inflation data is totally made up, it doesn't reflect my experience, like, you don't have to go very far in the internet weeds to find this kind of conversation. And obviously, the statistical agencies need to do everything they can to operate and be open and transparent and try to push back on some of that. But I do want to point out, these headwinds are real, and they are things that the statistical agencies aren't super empowered to change. So I live now in Silicon Valley. We are having a giant measles outbreak there. People are not getting vaccinated. It's not just statistical institutions where trust and expertise is under threat. So just pointing out some of these global headwinds to this. Fractured media environment. Rising inequality, I think, has special implications for economic data, because as inequality rises, our economic experiences diverge more, and you're often, with the statistical data, talking about aggregates. And when, the experience of the rich and powerful and the working class start to divide more and more, those statistical aggregates might represent people's experience a lot differently. The other global headwind to trust is that economic data has become harder to manufacture in many ways because of sort of changes in the culture which have negatively impacted productivity of collecting data. Sorry, I'm an economist. That was an extremely economist sentence. Declining response rates have increased the cost of collecting data because you have to ask more people before you get a yes. And budgets have not been increasing with those costs. That's been a problem in the US. It's also been a problem with statistical agencies everywhere. And economic volatility post-COVID that I raised in the beginning of the talk, it's just true that it's harder to measure an economy when there's more volatility. And so that's also a headwind. Okay, so the white text here is US, EU, and UK. Oh, wow, that really does not show up. Mike said his gray lines disappeared. So did mine. So there's a bunch of gray lines here, which are the response rates to the labor force survey for EU countries. See, I'm not making this up. You can see that. That arrow's there.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. So the point I want to make here is that the declining response rates we're seeing in the US, so the US starts here in like the top tercile of labor force response rates. By, this is like 2024, we're like in the middle of EU countries. So we declined slightly faster than most of the EU, but not by much, and we're still in the middle of the pack. So the point here is people often bring up the decline in response rates in the US as though it's a US-only phenomenon. It is not. It is global. And we're actually doing relatively well compared to other countries. The nightmare scenario is what's happened in the UK, which went from having a not great response rate in 2014 to here in the pandemic, you can see this decline, and then it sort of takes off catastrophically. So I was actually awaiting Senate confirmation for running BLS, which is, by the way, if you ever agree to a post where you were Senate, let me warn you that awaiting Senate confirmation is the most boring period you will ever experience professionally in your entire life. You can do nothing, you can do no public events. No one wants to give you anything to do because you might get a floor vote any day and disappear. So I read a lot of Financial Times. So I happened to be reading the Financial Times when the UK announced that they were no longer going to be able to produce an unemployment rate. And that was the fall of 23. At that point, the response rate for the labor force survey had dropped to 17%. For reference, the response rate for the US survey is 70%. I actually asked one of the statisticians at ONS at a conference, I was like, how did you know when to turn it off? And he was like, well, basically, we knew the response rates were getting really low, but we still had some confidence in the data, and then it began to point to a recession that no other economic indicator was indicating was underway. And we were like, okay, yeah, we have to turn this off. So until last year, a lot of the headwinds that the US had been experiencing, declining response rates, budget, fiscal challenges, a challenging media environment for information fact-based institutions, we were experiencing sort of the same thing that the globe was experiencing. The new administration brought some new challenges, which have made things even harder. The first was DOGE. I do not have time to tell you all the things that we had to, all of the operational challenges that DOGE brought to making statistics. We had more crises in a single week than probably most commissioners experienced in their entire terms. I wrote tons of politely worded memos to various people in the administration being like, if you let DOGE do this, there will be no jobs report and no inflation data in May or in June or in July. We did manage to stop many things from happening. The one thing I wasn't able to stop was the deferred resignation program, and about 15% of BLS staff took it. I think staffing is now down about 20%, and that's created all kinds of challenges for data collection and processing. Rising threat of political interference. Well, you may have heard that I was fired in August because the president did not like the numbers. So that was about 6 months ago. I spend a lot of time now on background with financial reporters who want to talk to me about whether the data is still trustworthy. That this is a real shock. This firing was a real shock to people's faith that the numbers were not being manipulated. So I'll answer the question. This is what I tell reporters now. So far, I'm the only person who's been fired. And the staff still continue to say there is no political pressure on them to manipulate data. But as long as they continue to say that, I think we're okay. But obviously some caution is warranted. Government shutdown. So we had a long government shutdown last fall. Some of the damage is permanent. There will be no unemployment rate for October of 25. There will be no inflation print for October of 25. You can't retrospectively collect that data. But some of the damage has been longer lasting. CPS response rates are still not back to where they were before the shutdown. Some of the inflation data has been, especially housing, some of the effects are more long lasting and are going to take some time to fade. So several new challenges. So that's sort of the high level overview of the landscape of trust. So Mike asked me to talk a bit about revisions, which are sort of often at the center of these conversations of how can you trust the data. And I think why revisions do end up in this sort of constant conversation of like how trustworthy are the numbers is because of this white print that you can't read. The paradox of revisions. When getting it right can look like we got it wrong. And I think this is fundamentally just a really hard thing to communicate to people, is that revisions are normal. And it doesn't mean that the first estimate wasn't a good estimate. It just means we got some slower moving data that we could use to improve it. So it is a tricky thing to communicate. And so first I want to say, why revise data? So there's basically, not all data gets as revised as heavily as things like jobs and GDP do. Mostly because you really need two conditions to be true to want a first estimate that gets revised. One is the data is so essential for policymaking that you need a timely indicator. You can't afford to wait, is the first criterion. Jobs data is one of the most important early indicators we get about turning points in the economy. You really don't want to wait too long for that data to come out if you've got a reliably good signal. The other criteria is there needs to be some slower moving data that can be used to improve it. And that's not true for everything. So like that's not true for the unemployment rate. The reason we have no October unemployment rate is we really just get that one shot. And there isn't some other slower moving data that's going to allow us to update that estimate. Doesn't mean that the unemployment estimate is worse than the jobs estimate that gets revised. Just means we don't get another shot. So I got a lot of questions about this during my Senate confirmation and also repeated oversight letters from Congress who wanted us to delay release of the jobs data. Like, why can't you just delay it 3 months? And the reason why is that first piece, which is so many economic actors, so many policymakers need that early read, and if they can't get it, they're gonna rely on less reliable data. So I actually saw this play out during the government shutdown, which delayed a lot of official data for about 2 months. Did the Fed sit around going, oh, well, you know, they'll get the government going. We'll see that data in 3 months. They'll be fine. No, they were using like scraped LinkedIn data. Like, they were using anything they could get their hands on. And so were journalists. And a lot of that private sector data was looking not great in the fall. And so people started, is this a turning point? And then the government came back online, the official data came out, everybody looked at it, they're like, no, it wasn't. So that's why you don't want to delay, is because if policymakers are making decisions off of worse data, you kind of want to avoid that outcome. So a couple more key points. You never want to assume that data that gets revised is less reliable than data that doesn't get revised. And that's the CPS versus CES point I brought up earlier. Sometimes we really just get that one shot. So the labor force survey, it's a great survey, but it's only 60,000 households. The payroll survey is 600,000 establishments. It is a much bigger survey. So even though it gets updated, if you're looking at labor market signals, you want both of them, let me be clear. But particularly if you're worried about job growth, you really want that payroll survey. Another thing you want to be cautious about is assuming that the amount of press attention that particular revisions get is related to how concern about accuracy. So I Googled this before this talk. I just Googled data revisions and looked at the first 20 hits. 2 were GDP. Everything else was jobs.
Wow.
Yeah. Why do job revisions get so much more press than GDP revisions? Because jobs data is much more salient to the public. Journalists like to talk about it. It is reported in nominal figures, which sound large. So if I talk to my mom and I'm like, oh, jobs got revised by 200,000, last 2 months. She's like, well, that sounds like a big number. Well, the US economy is just enormous. It's not a big number relative to the size of the US economy. If I tell her GDP got revised down 4 basis points, or 14, that's not, she's got no, she's not attached to any particular GDP number. It hits differently. And because jobs are more clearly understood and more clearly communicated, comms people, this is one thing I discovered in the White House, it was personally annoying to me. Comms people love jobs numbers. They're like, oh, well, we created X number of jobs, blah, 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 blah. And that also means that the opposition likes to go after those comms points. So if you want to attack someone's economic record, one way to do it is to attack the data itself. So the data comes under attack. Oh, thank God this was resolved. I would have a really hard time explaining this one. So remember I told you, if you Google the data revisions, you're going to get 10 times more hits for jobs than for GDP. Would you assume that jobs get revised more than GDP? You should not assume that. So these blue bars are jobs revisions. These are the annual benchmark revisions. And the yellow here is annual revisions to GDP. So if you take nothing away from this second half of this talk, one of the points I would make is CS is actually, the payroll survey is actually really accurate, especially when you consider how enormous the US economy is. Annual revisions are they're always less than 1%. They're usually less than 0.5%. The other thing I want you to notice here is I mentioned that they tend to go up when times are turbulent. So you can see there's some bigger revisions around the Great Recession. There's bigger revisions around COVID. That's typical. So this comparison isn't entirely fair because GDP is actually more complicated to measure than CES. You should expect the revisions to be somewhat bigger. It is a more complicated product, but these are both measures that are whole of economy measures. So in that respect, they are comparable. So one reason people are concerned about the accuracy of CES, even though it does remain very, very accurate, is because there has been this decline in response rates. And particularly, it's been in what is called initiation. That's this blue line here. Initiation is basically bringing new firms into the survey. And so the big hit to response has been more no's in adding firms. And so the concern is if the no's are increasing at this level, is the data becoming less representative? So that is sort of the background fear that everybody's worried about in terms of worrying about revisions. The other concern is this is the first month collection, and this is the amount of data they get by the second revision. And you can see that the amount of data they're getting for that first estimate has been declining. But so far, it does not seem to be impacting the size of revisions for that first. So there's two types of revisions for jobs, monthly revisions and annual benchmark revisions. So this is monthly revisions. And again, big takeaways are you see bigger monthly revisions in turbulent times. We've had 6 years of a lot of turbulence, economic and policy. This chart is nice because it breaks up those revisions by the unadjusted data versus the seasonally adjusted data, which unfortunately is not showing up very well in this slide. But one thing I want you to know is people forget about this, but you're looking at seasonally adjusted data most of the time. And one of the reasons that revisions pick up in turbulent times is seasonal adjustment models hate turbulence. They don't handle it particularly well. They like nice, stable growth rates. And it's one of those statistical esotericas people don't like to think about, but when you're in a turbulent time, you're going to see bigger revisions just because the seasonal adjustment model is going to be updating more. So before I get to the next slide, one point I wanted to make here. So I mentioned that those collection rates aren't impacting the monthly revisions very much yet. So a big reason for that is typically what's happening with those late reporters is they're not statistically different than the early reporters. Some of them are growing, some of them are shrinking. They tend to cancel each other out, and so you wind up usually getting something that's about what you got for the first estimate. There was one case where that was not true, and that was the month I was fired. And what happened here was unusual, but not unprecedented. So we had some very big monthly revisions in June and May of 25 that were because late reporting firms systematically reported losses. And this is a graph of those losses. So the commissioner does not see the data until it's finalized. We do not touch the data. There's a very firm line in BLS between the political appointee and the data generating process. So I saw this, and I said to the statisticians, I was like, well, what happened here? Because this is all the White House is going to want to know, is like, why did this happen? That's all I want to know. And they explained that this like systematic downward skew in the late arriving data. And I was like, has this ever happened before? And I'm like, yes, COVID, the Great Recession. I was like, does this mean, wait, does this happen at the start of recessions? They're like, yeah, it happens at the start of recessions. And I was like, oh.
It just keeps getting better.
Yeah, it just keeps getting better. And I was like, okay, whoa, let's think about this for a second. Let's go back to first principles, what's happening in the economy. So recall this is June and May. Liberation Day had happened in April. And there had been sweeping changes to immigration policy. There had been a lot, the economic uncertainty index had just basically gone through the roof in the last couple of months. I was like, what happened if maybe what happened here is because of all the uncertainty, everybody froze hiring, and it disproportionately impacted the late respondents. So this is what I was like, I'm speculating here, but this is one possibility. We will want to continue to monitor the data to see if this is an economic turning point, or if this is just a shock to policy uncertainty, or if this is just a change in the growth rate trend. So at the time, I did not know the answer to that question. So here's that June release. And this is the trend in employment growth. And I'm so sorry, this graph really did not resolve because the grays are not showing up. So basically, after here, you can see we basically are not, boy, I'm gonna just draw this trend line for you. We've basically been creating, on average, 0 jobs since then. So there really was a shift in trend job growth that those revisions did signal. So the unemployment rate, though, it's trending up a bit, but it's still relatively good. So this was not a recession indicator, but it wasn't really an indicator of a shift in the trend. Okay, so this is annual revisions. So that white print you can't see is latest benchmark revisions due to response, non-response error. So those were monthly revisions I showed you before. This is the annual benchmark revision. Again, note, economic volatility, bigger revisions. The thing I like about this graph, and I should mention here, so a lot of these graphs I'm taking from Ryan Decker's new paper on CES revisions, so he saved me a lot of work here by producing these graphs himself.
He just needs to use better colors.
So the nice thing about this is it breaks up the annual revision by how much of it's due to the net birth-death model error versus other components. And I'm going to focus on the latest data. So the thing that was actually kind of remarkable about the latest annual revision, which I think is still unexplained, is that most of it was not coming, in fact, almost none of it was coming from the birth-death model, which is typically where we miss when we miss. So what is driving that revision? It's response and non-response error. So response error is firms told BLS a different number than they gave to the QCW. And non-response error is that the non-respondents are shrinking more than the respondents are. And both of those components drove down the benchmark revision. The statisticians, when I left BLS, were still trying to understand why we saw this to a certain extent happen in 24 too. Goldman Sachs thinks that immigration, the immigration surge we saw in 23 and 24 is responsible for some of this wedge. I don't know if they're right. Personally, I worry about the increase in the imputation rate in the QCW. There's a lot of UI modernization happening. It's creating some challenges in QCW production sometimes. Yeah, see some nods. So hopefully this is temporary and it will bounce back, but it's still somewhat under investigation what's happening here. So, okay, to sum up, CS is a very accurate survey. The revisions get a lot of attention for lots of reasons that aren't particularly related to its data quality. In particular, like the last 6 years, because the economy has been volatile, it does make it more hard to measure. It makes seasonal adjustment harder. It makes lots of these things harder. And also there's more attention to the data. And it's just been a more fraught political environment, which adds to the conversation around the revisions. I want to end on an optimistic note. If you are worried about jobs data, the nice thing about jobs data compared to other domains where we collect economic data is there are actual solutions here that if with some political will you can do. The government actually has a lot of information about businesses, and in some countries they've turned the tax compliance system into part of the statistical infrastructure. And that is a very accessible solution with some political will. Australia did this during COVID. It's working out very well. This system's entirely voluntary. So a lot of the no's that we're getting that I showed you are basically, the survey comes knocking. They're like, oh, the government's here. We send this to legal. And legal's like, is this mandatory? And they're like, no. And the lawyers are like, no, we're not filling it out. So some states have moved to mandatory reporting, and you do see a boost in response rates. So that's another lever. Money for commercial data. Lots of people have pointed out there's a lot of payroll companies out there that have lots of data on firms. It is expensive. And right now the statistical agencies can't afford it. So that is where I will end, and we will move to the Q&A. Thanks.
Great. Thanks.